Well, I'd like to welcome all the committee members, including those that are here in person and those that are on the phone. Why don't we just jump right to the meeting logistics and roll call? So Trent, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Rural Groundwater Committee. At this point, you're probably familiar, but just a reminder for everyone listening, we'll go through some of the logistics quickly. Please note that this meeting is being broadcast via webinar and is being recorded. The recording and materials will be posted to the council webpage. If you're listening in, only members of the committee will be able to unmute themselves to participate in the meeting. Both online and in the room, please identify yourself before speaking. And if you have technical issues online, please call the ADWR help desk at 602-771-8444 or email tickets@azwater.gov. Now I'll just do a roll call, and like usual, if you are an alternate or online, please let us know so. Patrick Adams won't be joining us today. Paul Brierly, Maria Dadgar,
Jay Tompkins, alternate for Maria Dadgar.
Ron Doba.
Here.
Sandy Favorites.
Here.
Jamie Kelly.
County Supervisor Travis Lingenfelter for Jamie Kelly.
Senator Sina Kerr. Chris Kuzdas.
Here.
Sharon Magdahl.
Here.
Haley Paul. Karen Peters. I heard here online. Sarah Porter.
Here.
Stephanie Smallhouse.
Chad Smith on behalf of Stephanie Smallhouse.
Abe Springer. Craig Sullivan.
Present online.
Tom Torres. Representative Stacy Travers. Chris Udall.
Here.
And Chairwoman Amelia Flores. I believe she's online. And that's everybody. I'll pass it back to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Trent. Why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Tom for some welcome remarks.
Thanks, Bruce. So again, thanks to all members of the committee for your attendance today, both in person and online. We've done a lot of good work so far. We've had a lot of good discussions and taken a lot of feedback, and we're making some good progress. But we still have to keep in mind that Governor Hobbs asked us to make recommendations by December. So we're probably looking at the need for some draft recommendations kind of before Thanksgiving so that we can work through the rest of the process, including through the council, to get those recommendations to the governor in December. So we have a lot of work and time is getting shorter and shorter. So I'm looking for lots more progress today and hoping that we can, again, come to some consensus on some additional concepts. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Tom. If we could go to the meeting agenda, we'll try to keep ourselves to this time frame up here. But today's agenda, the welcoming remarks, meeting focus and objectives, you've all seen these, but it's just a reminder what our focus and objective is with this committee. And then we're going to discuss the key components of the proposed rural management framework. Our focus for this meeting is the acknowledgement of existing uses, council duties, and council goals. And I'll review the high-level concepts where we had majority agreement or consensus over review, initiation, and creation of the rural groundwater management. And then lastly, upcoming meetings and next steps and adjournment. I would like to remind you all too that at your table, we do have copies of written comments that were received from committee members. So each of you should have a hard copy of written comments that were submitted by committee members associated with council duties, council goals, and this acknowledgement of existing uses. Next slide, please. Today's meeting focus and objectives, I'll go over these again. You've all seen these before, but outside the active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, There is a limited regulatory framework for managing groundwater. There are no requirements for metering and reporting groundwater use outside AMAs and INAs. Some groundwater basins are experiencing significant growth in groundwater use. Many communities are facing aquifer depletion with limited access to renewable supplies and no tools to manage the groundwater declines. And there are increasing calls for a framework that will assist rural communities to manage their groundwater resources. Next slide. The committee goals and objectives by December 2023, as Tom mentioned, we need to develop policy, legislative, or other actionable recommendations for the governor that provide a groundwater management framework that assists rural communities to manage local groundwater resources, protect water users, and sustainably manage aquifers. These recommendations will assist rural communities outside the AMAs and INAs in managing local groundwater resources and mitigating further aquifer depletion. These recommendations should be broad enough to apply to any groundwater basin's management needs and customizable to be tailored to a basin's unique characteristics. So you've heard that before, but we want to bring those up at each meeting so we all have a good understanding of the focus of the Groundwater Committee goals and objectives. The meeting objectives for today, and I mentioned this earlier, but is to continue discussion of proposed rural groundwater, the proposed rural groundwater management framework. Again, I'll go through those high-level concepts that were agreed upon when we discuss the initiation and creation. And then we'll focus the majority of the meeting on the three areas: acknowledgement of existing use, council duties, and area goals. We want to follow the same process that we used at previous meetings: an overview of the key components and committee member comments, discussion with the committee, and then a recognition of comments with majority agreement or consensus and any alternative views. I think I've said this before, but I want to reiterate this again. Our plan is as we come to a consensus on these high-level concepts, those high-level concepts will be the components of the recommendation to the governor. Alternative views, of course, will be noted, but I just want to remind all of you that that's the anticipated process and where we're headed when it comes to developing these recommendations for the governor. Next slide. Discuss key components of proposed rural management framework. Next slide, please. If you recall, the committees to draft and recommend a new framework for rural groundwater management, and we came up with a term, rural groundwater management area. The initial proposal and the proposal that we're working on today was really built on the LGSA legislation that was proposed this last year. Why? What are some of the reasons? Past input on the concept design came from a wide variety of rural stakeholders, water users, and officials. It provided an alternative, flexible approach to AMA or INA that also focuses upon managing the aquifer. It accommodates local situational and issues and unique characteristics of each basin. There's local water user oversight, planning and development, ADWR management, approval and support, and there's a focus on priority basins. Where overpumping is occurring, we're seeing declines in aquifer levels, there's physical signs of distress, whether that's wells going dry or evidence of subsidence. Next slide. What are the framework key components that we've been addressing? At our last meeting, as I mentioned, we talked about initiation and creation. Today, we're going to focus on those areas that are acknowledgement of existing use, council duties and area goals. At future meetings, for the 10/19 meeting, we're hoping to get to area plan and council membership, depending on how things go today. And then for our first meeting in November, which is November 16th, it's sunset review and any additional concepts. Now, there's about a 1 month time frame between October 19th and November 16th. If we aren't making progress at the speed that I think we need to in order for us to to meet the deadline for the governor. We may schedule another meeting between October 19th and November 16th, so we'll see how it goes. Next slide. Initiation and creation. So I'll go through these very, very quickly. Next slide. We have majority agreement on key concepts. Number one, the director has the option to initiate the process to create a rural groundwater management area. Criteria should not be more onerous than creating an AMA, and it should be created when there has been a significant decrease in aquifer levels over time and access to groundwater supplies are being threatened. So that's what was agreed upon at our last meeting. We had a couple of alternative views from committee members. Senator Kerr, there's concern with the director being able to initiate the process, and Stephanie Smallhouse, director initiation should only be used in an emergency as a secondary option. Next slide, please. For the local initiation process, there was also majority agreement on these key concepts. The process can be initiated by County Board of Supervisor resolutions or petitioned by percentage of area registered voters. There was some alternative views that were expressed and that have been noted. Senator Kerr and Stephanie Smallhouse, the petition needs to be signed by a majority of residents or groundwater users. And Stephanie Smallhouse, the process shouldn't be initiated by county boards of supervisors. Next slide. Under the public hearing and approval associated with the initiation, there was a majority agreement on the key concepts, ADWR to conduct the hearing process similar to the AMAs and INAs, and the director has final designation authority. There were committee member alternative views that have been noted. Senator Kerr and Stephanie Smallhouse, final designation should be decided by an election, and local residents through an election. So with that, I thought I'd remind you of those items, and I thought our next slide, what I'd like to do is begin work on there was one other area where we also received majority agreement, was on the interim pause. And that's a need for a pause on growth, and by growth we mean additional wells that are serving additional uses within the area. That begins when the rural groundwater management area is designated, and this pause continues until a management plan is approved by DWR. No new non-exempt wells would be allowed within area boundaries, but there would be some exceptions for supplies necessary for the protection of human health and safety. Committee member alternative views that were noted, there should be the pause needs to apply to all users with any exceptions to be specific and tied to statute. And a couple of the exception language options that have been noted, one is if it's in order to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, you may need to move a well potentially for a municipal or private water company users, or if there's a need for a well replacement. Your well collapses, there's an issue associated with your well, and you need to replace that well. Yes, Sharon.
May I ask a question about the wording on that last slide? Where it says a pause on growth, I think you're meaning increase in groundwater use?
Yes.
And so I think that wording could be refined a little bit.
We will.
Thank you.
It's really a pause on, new wells, development of new wells for new uses. Yep. Next slide, please. So our focus today, the first issue that we'd like to focus on, key concept, is this need for acknowledgement of existing use. And this was expressed by all the committee members that there is this need to acknowledge existing users. Next slide. From last week's meeting, we had quite a bit of discussion on this issue and came to the conclusion, yes, there is a need to document current groundwater uses and users if a rural groundwater management area is established. That would recognize existing groundwater uses served by non-exempt wells. Uses within the rural groundwater management area would be required to measure and report water pumped from all non-exempt wells. There's a need to quantify current uses to monitor progress on protecting the aquifer and promoting conservation. And all existing groundwater uses served by non-exempt wells would receive, we have acknowledgement, we've heard certificate, we've also heard a registry of current groundwater use. So we're still in the throes of trying to determine what we call this acknowledgement or registry or certificate. But for today, we'll use the two terms acknowledgement or certificate. Committee comments. We received some comments, and I'd like to go over those comments. Stephanie Smallhouse, her provided comments that there's a need for certification, flexibility, and transferability associated with these acknowledgements, and need to protect current water users and uses in the area. Ron Doba provided a comment. Acknowledgement of existing use should be made for this tool. Chris Kuzdas provided a comment. There's a need for certainty and protections for water use while promoting aquifer health. Chris and Jamie Kelly and Commissioner Lingenfelter, it should not establish a priority system between users and uses. And Jamie and Commissioner Lingenfelter also provided a comment. It should be these certificates or acknowledgements should be built upon the tenet that rural groundwater is a public good that belongs to the state and should be fairly distributed. It must protect water providers, and it should tie water conservation with land use planning. What I'd like to do is open it up to those that have made comments and those from the committee and see if there are any, if you'd like to further provide some further context associated with your comments, and if there are any questions from the committee members. County Commissioner Langenfelter, did you have a question?
Oh, not at this time, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Any comments? Let's move on to the next slide. Here are some of the key principles that we've developed associated with the acknowledgement certificate. It applies to all sectors and water use types. There's a need for sufficient information to make the determination. It only applies to groundwater withdrawn from non-exempt wells. It's subject to conservation or efficiency measures or other actions identified in the management plan needed to achieve the management area goal. The process to establish could be streamlined versus the AMA application process. And it should provide flexibility for water users and the local economy while achieving the management area goal. Chris had a comment, a written comment to some of these principles that they should apply across all sectors, require measuring and reporting, and be paired with a conservation program. So I'd like to open it up to the committee members to see if there are any comments, thoughts on these key principles. Yes, Sandy.
At some point, we don't have to do it right now, but the term, so the subject to conservation or efficiency measures, that is completely understandable, and we support that. Or other actions identified in the management plan with some boundaries, right? I mean, I think that's when we can get to sort of laying those things out, I think it'll be important to sort of define what that means. It's really open-ended. And I think we need to be super careful on open-ended terms.
Agreed. Ron.
Ron Doba-Namwa. First of all, I think this acknowledgement of existing groundwater use is going to be critical to everybody around here coming together on a recommendation as far as consensus goes. But I'm thinking about all these non-exempt wells in the rural areas that are not metered now, and it's just something that we have to give some thought to as far as if we're going to acknowledge some sort of groundwater use, how do we quantify that with no history?
Yeah, we have one of the next slides will talk about what should be in that acknowledgement, so we'll have some discussion on that.
Okay, thanks.
Chad?
So, excuse me, clarification, so will we be able to incorporate the historical use into this concept principle?
That's on the next slide too, yes, where we'll talk about what is in the acknowledgement and what kind of information needs to be, historical information needs to be collected. Yes, Paul?
Part of that before, I want to bring it up again, is whether we would consider for agricultural water use, using modeling from satellite imagery and whatnot rather than metering. And I was going to offer, because I've been involved in that for the last 8 years, just to explore state-of-the-art costs, opportunities, what accuracy, to see whether that would be an option that would give us good enough information without metering each well.
You know, I think that's something that we need to consider as another alternative to verifying use, but I think about the only way that you can have a real accurate understanding of what's being extracted versus, you know, the condition of the aquifer would be beyond some sort of metering, but I know that that type of technology is being used and it's being expanded throughout the
It's
West.
come a long ways.
Right, I know, yeah.
We have some experts at USDA and U of A that are pretty well versed in the capabilities.
I think part of the struggle, as I think through it, was, you know, if you do develop efficiency programs in conservation, how do you measure and how do you track that without having some indication of, you know, what you're pumping in and what's being metered?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think we could get some indication with those tools, and I'd be happy to look into that.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, just say that in the active management areas, reporting can be done other than through metering, through some methodologies. And so kind of in that context, we could look at that as another tool to achieve reporting that could be certified, so to speak, to achieve that goal of reporting the water use.
Yes, Chris.
I would echo Director Brierly's comments. We do have growers in Arizona that farm in California also, and their new groundwater statutes are allowing them to use OpenET to measure. And I think that it gives them ability to also look at recharge, what's runoff, recharge, those types of things, but it's actually showing what the plant is using. And I think that could be, that can coincide with groundwater pumping to find out exactly what the farmer's using, not how much is diverted to the farm.
Thank you, Chris. And I will let you know that we do have a meeting this week with someone that's utilizing this technology here in Arizona and in California. So I just don't know enough about it. Yes, Chad.
Sorry, I didn't announce who I was. Chad Smith. So back to the subject to conservation or efficiency measure, does that make it, in order to get whatever we're going to call it a certificated water right, does it make it mandatory?
When it comes to focusing on aquifer conditions and depending on what the goal is associated with the basin, and assuming that that goal has to do with continued depletion of the aquifer, I think conservation or efficiency will be probably one of the primary goals that will be developed by the council when it comes to end users in order to reach the overall goal to sustainably manage that aquifer. But I'm sure there'll be others.
So I'll add, in the active management areas, for example, the irrigation grandfather rights were certified before the first management plan ever came out, right? I think the two concepts in the fourth bullet and the last bullet really are about whatever this acknowledgement is, it can't be something that precludes an outcome in which the management goal, or if that management goal is to protect the aquifer or slow down the decline of the aquifer, or whatever that is, these acknowledgements can't preclude managing that use in a way that makes it impossible to achieve the goal. So an acknowledgement can't be you have 1,000 acre feet of water and there can never be any program, efficiency, conservation, or whatever that would reduce your 1,000 acre feet of water. That's what those two bullets really are talking about.
Representative Travers?
That sounded like a really fancy way of saying if we have any kind of grandfathered water rights and really weak management goals, then there's nothing to stop somebody with those grandfathered rights to keep pumping if there's nothing there in place that can track any kind of data or sort of mitigate what that water depletion is. Am I correct?
So in the active management areas, for example, we can't shut down agriculture, but we can impose conservation requirements on it to reduce the groundwater use under the law in each subsequent management plan. So we're not saying that an acknowledgement would prohibit regulation of those uses. We're saying the acknowledgement has to be structured in a way that we are allowed to regulate under the terms and conditions of the management program associated with the management area, those uses. In agriculture, in municipal and industrial, kind of the same way we do that in the active management areas.
Senator Kerr.
Thank you. For clarification, I guess I want to say that this is Senator Kerr. I didn't announce myself, but in the active management areas, there was an understanding that there was renewable water supplies. And so that works in that concept with that knowledge. And correct me if I'm wrong, or I'll just ask, are there renewable supplies in the basins that you could apply the same concept to?
So Senator Kerr, we anticipate in most of these basins there are not renewable water supplies. But for just as an example, when the CAP farmers lost their CAP water, it didn't then relieve them of their obligation to meet the conservation requirements under the management plans. Just as an example of how under the groundwater code, the linkage or lack thereof to renewable water supplies works or ended up working today.
And if I might just add, Bruce, that I would say that my position would be that whatever the water right or this principle ends up being, that it is a mechanism that can't and doesn't reduce the water right.
So Senator Kerr will note that, but from my perspective, if that's the outcome of these water right acknowledgements for ag, municipal, and industrial, you're almost going into a situation in which you're not going to be able to manage the aquifer in a positive way. There might be some opportunities to create more recharge through natural recharge processes or other things, but just like we do in the active management areas with all of these rights, we have to have a way through conservation and efficiencies at a minimum to reduce that use over time. And that was one of the basic tenets of the groundwater code and how the management plans were set up. And so that's what, from my perspective, these acknowledgements or certificates need to follow that same outcome so we can actually positively benefit and manage the aquifer at the end of the day.
if I might, to that point, I think focusing on those, efficiencies lead to, naturally, to conservation. And so I think, a strong emphasis, investment in all kinds of water efficient projects and methods would lead to, naturally, to conservation without reducing a water right.
So I guess I'll probe that a little bit with you, Senator. So if there's a situation where increased efficiencies create conservation and a reduced use by a water user, would that water user then, under this acknowledgement or certificate, be able to expand their use back to the full amount of their acknowledgement or certificate?
If you could restate that for me, I'm not sure I understood.
Pick on ag since it's easier to understand probably. So if an agricultural producer is using 1,000 acre feet, they become more efficient and now they're only using 900 acre feet. Does that mean they could take the other 100 acre feet and start farming new land, as an example?
I think that's a possibility, or a different use perhaps, something like that. I think just in general, as I've been meeting with primarily different ag stakeholders, it's apparent, I mean, this is a huge concept. It needs a lot more vetting than we can even give it in, these meetings, sitting here for, an hour or two. What I'm finding, there's a lot of different opinions, a lot of thought, and different comments coming in, variety, some, just all, kind of everywhere so far from the meetings I've been able to have. What I would really like to ask the department to do is hold a forum for those potential, for the regulated communities, and get their feedback and be there to answer questions. I think that is such a better way, I would say, to be able to hear from all of the stakeholders, those potential regulated people, communities, entities. And I know that, when I'm crafting legislation, and I know that whatever I'm putting together is going to require a regulation on someone, you get them in the room, you want to make sure that, that they have input, their concerns are heard and answered. And so I would really like to see the department hold forum or forums to gather that information, because this is such a broad subject.
I guess, Senator Kerr, I would just offer that these discussions is that forum. That's what we're here to do now through the committee and through the council process.
Mr. Allen, if I may make a comment, this is
Yes.
Supervisor Lingenfelter.
Yes.
If the department is going to consider giving some sort of acknowledgement of current use, we believe that there should be a really strong mandated commitment to conservation. And the reason for that is, under the plan that is adopted in one of these areas, I'm sure that there's going to be some private investments from people to do water efficiency projects and things like this, but there are going to be some other major conservation measures, such as recharge basins and things like this, that are going to fall upon the counties and the cities, if they have a municipal water system, or the water providers, to go to taxpayers or ratepayers to say, we need to do this project to do conservation, and you're going to have to shoulder the cost of that. So it doesn't make any sense to go to taxpayers or ratepayers to invest into some of these sort of conservation things if there isn't a strong commitment to conservation, because all that does is really subsidize the largest water users in that basin, and it's not fair to taxpayers.
Thank you. Chad?
Chad Smith. To that point, I don't know that we could advocate or support a mandated conservation mechanisms, but I do think we also have to keep in mind and recognize historical conservation that's taken place, especially in agriculture, and being able to recognize as we start talking about those historical uses, what conservation measures that have already taken place. and to director's point, I think we got to incentivize it, not mandate it. So if we're going to take away some of their water rights or what they've historically used, that's not going to incentivize conservation.
So I'll just say some of that would be embedded in the management plan. And those management plans, as I understand they're heading towards, are something that are enforceable management plans, right? And again, keeping in mind what we're trying to accomplish with a new regulatory overlay is something different than an AMA, maybe with more flexibility, with some more simplicity, but always in the backdrop that AMA is always a tool that can be triggered when those basins meet the criteria under the statutes.
Sharon?
Yeah, so I have a few comments based on things people said. And I'll just put out there, I don't see how we can move forward with some kind of meaningful groundwater management, basin management, without having conservation built in. I just don't see, but the details of that will come out through the plans. So we're talking principles here, and I realize there's difference of opinion on the principles, and I understand that. But for me, I need to see some conservation in there. To Senator Kerr's point about the what is going on in the AMAs. So we're not going to be AMAs, but we keep bringing in what's going on in the AMAs to give us kind of a baseline framework for things. And I have to admit that I've lost I haven't kept track of the details of the ag programs in the 4th and 5th management plans. But the way I always looked at it, you had your water right, and we're calling these acknowledgements right now. We're not even saying they're water rights. But you had a water right, but then you had those water duties, right? And that put on a limit on how much of that water right you could use up to that water right. And then we developed best management practices, which I think made some of that quantification of water duties go away. And I don't really know where we are in the 4th and 5th management plans because I haven't followed those in detail. If there were some kind of way to share that with us in a way that's easier than having each of us look on the website, on the management plans, I'd be kind of curious just to get information on what those look like, if there is a way. And then the other thing I want to just mention is that we are talking about all the different sectors here, and that's something that's been pointed out, I think, in the words here and in the comments made that, yes, in many of the basins, agriculture is the biggest, but they're never the only, and in some basins, they're not the biggest. So we have to think about all of the sectors. So I just wanted to note those things.
Thank you. Sandy?
So on that, kind of building off of, AMA versus what these are, and I guess we all need to get on the same page about, are we creating an alternative to an AMA, with the AMA being the ultimate tool, as you've said, that can be triggered at some point in time, or is this a way to avoid becoming an AMA? And that's unclear to me. And if it's a way to avoid becoming, if you look at it from that standpoint and you want to, an AMA, we've got to reduce our groundwater because we're in an overdraft situation. Here, we could be in an overdraft situation, but it may not be at the AMA, it may not be that critical. And creating a program with conservation's key to that, and recognizing that people have been doing conservation, as was pointed out. But you create a system where you stop the bleed, I guess is the best way to put it. You create a system where you have these, I liked what you said earlier, not certificates, but there was another word you used, whatever they're called. But you create some flexibility in that system where you can't grow that the basin is managed with the resources that you have, and those are traded around. You can grow, you can expand your acreage as long as you're not increasing your water use, but you're increasing your efficiency. And I think that, to me, at least you stop that, you create this point in time where we can really step back, take a look, and see what needs to be done. And that, I think, would be a bigger help in the long run in groundwater management statewide, rather than trying to replicate an AMA system that is the ultimate backstop, or the ultimate, sort of where we don't want to be, but trying to create something that helps us avoid that. But that's just my opinion. And I think you can do this without, you have this water, you've had this water, you've used it wisely or whatever, and you have a volume of water. That water can be utilized by other users, and you have to cut back on your users. But overall in the basin, you're not increasing water use or groundwater extraction. Some way around there where you're sort of stopgapping an AMA, or hopefully, or if that's the objective.
County Commissioner Langenfelter.
Mr. Holland, I would say one of the main reasons for these acknowledgements, whatever they're called, is, as everybody knows, we all have to do the Growing Smarter legislation, the general plans. Right now, in the rural areas, we're almost completely devoid of certainty when it comes to water planning, because there's other sections in statute. The one I would mention is 11-812, where if you have 5 or more acres, you're exempt from going through any sort of a land use process. And in Mojave County's case has been demonstrated, the projections of a general plan, which only lasts 10 years, can change very rapidly before you even do your next general plan. The purpose is to hopefully provide us some certainty in water planning, which is needed by all sorts of development, every type of development. Right now, we don't have that.
Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, Bruce. So I think, so for me, three points in thinking about this approach to acknowledgements, certificates, or registry. Was that the third word? Yeah, registry. Yeah, I think that's good. For me, it's an equitable approach to cover all sectors. I see that in here. I think by necessity, paired with mandatory measuring and reporting, and certainly to Paul's point, that could include satellite-based approaches. That makes sense. But for me, it's also that pairing with the mandatory conservation program. When we look at groundwater management, pretty much anywhere in the West, it sort of gets set up and then walk that use back over time. And so yes, it is stop the bleeding in these basins, but a lot of our basins, or a number of our basins, are pretty sick. So also getting on the path of healing. And so I think there's some interesting ways, maybe some new ways we could do that through flexibilities, but certainly that mandatory pairing with conservation. And that's how we do it in the AMAs. That's how it's done pretty much everywhere else. That's the logical way to do it. Otherwise, we do risk just institutionalizing decline and eventual collapse in these basins if we're handing out an acknowledgement, but there's no pairing or link to a regulatory program.
Thank you. Tom.
Chris, I'll just say, to me, it's a matter of sequencing. You have the acknowledgement, you know what's out there. You look at the health of the aquifer, and they're variable. We showed some of the more key areas when Ryan did his presentation, and you figure out, not all at once, but maybe over time, how you want to make the aquifer more healthy. So I'm having a hard time figuring out upfront as a condition of creating an acknowledgement what you would pair it to, because you almost have to go through the whole management area planning process to know what that pairing really should look like. But again, I see that as sequencing. You create the acknowledgement first. The acknowledgements are done in a way that it leaves open room for that pairing of the conservation or whatever other programs are out there to meet the ultimate goal of that management area.
Representative Travers.
And I say this very respectfully to Mr. Smith and to Director Bushadsky. Whatever we're doing right now is not working. So if we have, voluntary measures that are, optional, even if people are still conserving now, clearly it's not working. So something needs to be done that creates a mandatory effect.
So again, looking at the existing tool, the active management area, if an active management area is established, people apply for the irrigation grandfather right, again, to use agriculture. We don't restrict the volume of that right based on some conservation goal that's 10 or 20 or 30 years out there. In the AMAs, it's based on the prior 5 years of use and their crop history, and they get a water duty, and then you start to look at how the conservation programs might achieve that reduction in groundwater that's required by the law. So what's happening right now in the rural areas is there's no management, right? There's nothing being done where there's not an INA or an AMA, except there are efficiencies being applied in various sectors for lots of different reasons, and maybe the major one is the economics, and it pays for those people to be efficient because of the cost of doing business, and it benefits them. So again, I think we know that there's ultimately some need for these acknowledgements to be subject to the plan as it's developed out into the future. I'm just looking to make sure that there's not an outcome in the acknowledgement itself that would prohibit or limit how you could create a more healthy aquifer. But I'm also for sequencing this in a way that the acknowledgement comes first. Then when the plan's put together, you figure out how to implement that plan and figure out the impact on the existing water users.
Sandy.
One of the things that we struggled with early on when we were doing the second management plan and implementing that was, the starting point where everybody's sort of equal, and where some people, because there are entities out there, whether they're agriculture, municipalities, or industry, who have done conservation and are extremely efficient, but they're starting at the same, there's this, when you start everybody at the same point and you assume that everybody's going to reduce at the same level, some folks have tapped that out, or they're as efficient or close to as efficient as they can be. So creating additional reductions sometimes creates hardships that or objectives that are unachievable, and that's just a hindsight thing from implementing these management plans for multiple times. And I don't know how we get around that, but I think that's what I was hearing, that there has to be some recognition of prior conservation. I don't know how we do it, but it's something to discuss. It's like, I'm trying to avoid the mistakes, not mistakes, sorry, Kathy. There were no mistakes, but some of the things that we learned as we were implementing the groundwater code through the second and third management plans.
So Sandy, I agree that that's something up for discussion. Again, going back to what exists in the AMAs, there's the variances and the admin reviews that are one of the tools, or maybe the main tool, that was designed to look at unique circumstances and designed to look at what folks have already done so that they're not penalized vis-a-vis kind of their neighbors, because the starting point in 1980 wasn't equal either. And those admin reviews and variance processes also allow you to look at, localized conditions. Again, agriculture is an easier example if you have certain soil types, if you have certain salinity in your water and things like that. So I think that's a whole part and parcel of what can be embedded in the management plan itself that goes with these new areas, and how the implementation can create an outcome that you're looking for, i.e. make the aquifer more healthy, but do it in a way that is equitable as possible, and as flexible as possible, recognizing that even within a basin, the conditions aren't the same across the basin.
Chris.
Yeah, so Director Brushatsky, I think the concept of sequencing makes sense, and if I'm understanding it, the point would be when it comes to these acknowledgements or certificates, keeping it open in the sense that a conservation program and other tools as established in the management plan could apply to it. And I think that makes sense. I don't know of another way to do it. And I think on the other side, providing that certainty. So I think in Senator Kerr and some of your comments, the acknowledgement of existing infrastructure investments, I think that should be factored in as well. And then Sandy, I think you mentioned something about tradability, and I think I've read it in some of the comments here. That could be another way. There's probably ways to go about that too that could address aquifer health, and we could get to that at some point as well.
Sandy.
Yeah, back to the point on, administrative reviews and variances, those are great, and they were good tools, and having done so many of those for my early part of my career, I guess what I'm trying to avoid is there's a way to do some of that on the front end. You avoid, because the administrative burden on your staff, it's pretty intense going through those administrative, there's a lot of stuff that goes into those. I was just trying to think, is there a way that we could with these acknowledgements, build some of that in on the front end, that you have to demonstrate certain things that would give you some of those variances, or do some of that administrative.
I think that's a good segue to the next slide. Talks about historical information and data, and hopefully that'll help guide and answer some of these questions. So why don't we go to the next slide? Acknowledgement certificate, the establishment of it, determine the type of historical information and data that should be submitted. We included the user, whether it's the legal landowner or the reporting party. We're thinking the location of use would be information and data that should be submitted. Well registration number, type of use, total pumping volume. And these are really all applicable to all the users. And then the next two are more agricultural focus that can help get an understanding of efficiencies, but irrigated acres and type of crops. So those are some of our thoughts regarding the type of historical information data that should be submitted. So I'll open that up to questions, and then we'll talk about what is on the acknowledgement or certificate. We had a couple of comments. Thanks for pointing that out, Trent. Chris, they should be based on the previous 5 years of data, and Stephanie suggested that it should be based on the previous 10 years of data for the historical information. So I'll open that up for comment. Paul.
I would just notice it may be obvious, but I just wanted to note that can vary so greatly. So we do need to have enough history to allow for that variation depending on what crops are doing, whether they grew year round. It just, to think that there's one measure is not accurate.
Thank you. And then we also included, well, what would be on the acknowledgement certificate or the registry? Is it number of acres or location of where the water use is taking place? Or is it just a historical quantity based off past water use? So you'd have the user name, maybe just historical past usage, and then that's what's included on the acknowledgement or certificate. Sharon.
So I pay a lot of attention to the way slides are and the words on the slides. Because of the way you've laid this out, somebody who just picks up these slides will think we're only talking about agriculture. So I think you need to make it clear that we're not only talking about agriculture, because in the second part you also have acres, and that's not relevant to communities that are serving water to their people. And so that's my main comment. I still want to just go back to the last slide. You don't have to go back there, but you know, I agree with this idea of the built-in efficiencies, right? And I just want to note that, and I mentioned best practices. That's become a real part of the conservation programs as I understand them. And so if you have best practices and somebody's done them and can check those off, then they don't have to do more. So again, it goes back to that, what's actually in the plan and what's developed as it. And I just wanted to underscore that. Thanks.
Sandy.
I think the other, I don't mean to bring in another question, but is it a well by well, or is it, you know, I mean, I like the concept of flexibility within cropping. You could grow, I mean, you could do more acres with the same amount of water, have some flexibility in that, as long as you're not using, as long as you're not exceeding some volume based on something. But I'm struggling with, are we issuing these registries or acknowledgements by the well or by the owner or some land base? And that's the difficulty here, because if it's land-based, then it infers that ag is stuck in that land, or users, cities,
Right.
whoever are stuck in that land and can't utilize their resources and the efficiencies that they develop over time and expand or whatever. I think we'd be careful with that, but yeah, we need to figure that out first, if
Right.
it's a well-by-well acknowledgement.
Yes, County Commissioner Langenfelter.
Yeah, Mr. Holland. I really appreciated Director's comment on sequencing. I think that makes a lot of sense, that everybody that's currently using water in a basin would be acknowledged on some sort of a high level. And then the council, ADWR, would listen to stakeholders and get around the table when they're doing that management plan, and they would decide what that means. Again, we're in some of these basins, and in Mojave County, for instance, the Wallapai Basin, right now we're stuck with, we believe, a 34,000 acre-foot deficit coming out of the basin every year. So we need more in some of these rural basins than just to stop the bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have, we need to recognize that some of these rural basins, they don't have any other supply side options when it comes to current users. So I liked the comment and appreciated the comment for the sequencing. You acknowledge on a general level, and then when everybody gets together, you decide what that means.
Thank you. Paul.
Another use for the historical pumping in the supplies to all sectors is to show that conservation that's happened. So the further you go back, the more you can record that we have, this user has put in place conservation measures.
Thank you. Chad.
And Sharon, thank you for that comment, because it does feel like it's all centered on agriculture. But I think the 10-year allows for a broader picture, because markets and agriculture are so volatile. And when we start talking about types of crops, that'll change based on markets and how volatile it is. And so we really got to have a broader historical usage.
So as far as the time frame, we can have more conversations, right? The AMAs, the groundwater code was 5 years. CAP eligibility was 10 years. Having worked on that with the guy next to me once in my life as well. So there's there's definitely room for what the right historical time frame. I like Paul's comment that a benefit of a longer time period, you can maybe still show sequentially the efficiencies and conservation that's occurred over time. In relation to the best management practices, Sharon's comment, it was a great comment. You know, in the fifth management plan, we added required BMPs to be done because of the requirement in the groundwater code to have increasingly increased reductions of groundwater in each subsequent management plan. So there's a point system attached to that, and then we raised points and categories and total points, which essentially meant you had to do either different or more BMPs than you did in the prior plan. And we had a long process through the BMP committee to get agriculture and folks comfortable with how that worked in the fifth management plan.
And I guess I would add too, Paul, that that's one of the reasons we added types of crops, because how do you know if they're being efficient if you don't know what kind of crops they're growing, right? So those were some of the reasons why we added some of those elements up there so that you could show that. Senator Kerr.
Thank you, Bruce. I just wanted to lend my support for the longer historical, at least 10 years.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
I'd echo that. If a resort or a major use of non-exempt water is destroyed, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years to redo. So I think a 10-year window is better. I also wanted to talk about those that are up on the screen right now, that if a council member approaches what happens, I think it's those, speaking from an ag perspective, those who are actively involved in production agriculture hopefully would be the ones to be able to determine those particular issues up there in that council process.
So Chris, are there items on this list that we don't think water users would be able to submit the information on any of those categories?
I think that they all could be submitted. I don't know if they would want to submit every one of those, I guess is where I'm coming from. I would just leave it to them as my opinion.
Ron. Thanks, Chris.
Well, one of the things I noticed with this slide is the lack of a time period as well. But in hearing and I'm not an expert when it comes to ag, the difference between 5 years and 10 years, would something like up to 10 years where the applicant could identify during the previous 10-year period what he was applying for and show in his application what he was trying to get acknowledgement for?
They may not have 10 years worth of data, so good point. Sandy.
Just to follow up on my previous comments, conservation activities that have been enacted should be on here as well as part of the certification. If we're going to try to pre-fill,
okay,
do that.
Thank you. Representative Travers.
I was going to say the same thing that Ron Doba said, to have a variance, 5 years, but then based on, usage, do you need a few more years of extra data to help determine or not? Because you don't want to get into a situation where if we've got climate change or whatever, and all of a sudden you see these anomalies, and then you say, well, I can't get enough, I don't understand it. If you see a trend and know that there's something else there behind it that maybe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So I have to ask to make sure we're not missing anything or talking past each other. In terms of the time frame, my view is that the acknowledgement is today's use, not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, but the value of the historic period is when it comes to implementing a plan that might require more efficiencies or conservation, and you've already kind of paid at the office, so to speak. Is that the view of others in this room?
Sharon?
So maybe I interpreted the comments a little differently, Tom, than you just put back. And Sarah and I were just quietly whispering about this. But I interpreted the comments to mean if there were, somebody had already implemented a lot of conservation efficiency, and they're not the same, and we know that, but we're using them together, measures, they might not have that much potential to do more. And so it depends, again, it goes to the details of what the conservation program looks like in the actual plan. So if you're already very, efficient, you may not be able to say cut back. It's like California. What did they do with their communities? They had the mandatory, everybody cuts back 36% or 24%, and people said that wasn't fair because some of the communities already had cut back and had done conservation. So maybe I was misinterpreting it or whatever, but that's what I thought, Chad, you might have been getting at. So I was just thinking, looking forward, you may not have as much potential if you've already done a lot compared to somebody who hasn't done much. So I don't know. That's how I was hearing it.
Thanks, Sharon. Paul?
So I was not looking at it the same way you did, Director. And I'll give an example. If I understood you of using the number that's being used right now, say that for the last 9 years you farmed alfalfa, but this year you farmed wheat and you use half as much water, and you use that half as much water as your baseline when typically you've used a lot more, that would be a problem, I think.
County Commissioner Langenfelter.
Thank you. I may be wrong on this, but when I look at this, asking people to quantify how much water they're using today, which is all that matters, it almost sounds a little bit like a priority system. And really, if you just go back and you say on a general level, we acknowledge everybody is using water here. In the management plan, when you look at the general plan, the economic development plan, all these things, and I mean, you're going to have a reduction goal or a conservation goal that has to be shared by everybody, and it's not going to be the same in every basin. That's the reason that we're trying to go for a third tool and not an AMA, to try to recognize the unique circumstances in every one of these basins. So just a generalized acknowledgement, and then when everybody gets, around the table, I wouldn't think that it would be productive to say, well, we're going to protect our 30,000 acre feet, or we're going to protect this much acre feet. How does that help you? How does that create a healthier basin? I don't understand that. I mean, it would be, the management goal would be, we want to conserve this much. How are we going to do that in this basin across all sectors? And that would give you an opportunity to look at conservation and improvement and efficiencies, things that other industries and stakeholders have done.
Mm-hmm. And if you looked at it from a well perspective, that'd give you that flexibility. Mm-hmm. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, really quick, because I submitted comments on this. So I put 5 years as the baseline to look at, just because that's how it is in the AMAs and INAs. I don't know if that necessarily needs to be hard and fast. I think it also depends on, how I would look at that would be like, what is the character, what is the exact legal character of these acknowledgements, and then maybe like, how do other things on this proposal start to move as well?
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? If not, we'll move on. I know we've acknowledged this. I think what I'd like to do is talk about some other topics to consider. There's a lot of devils in the details here, and I think when we get to the general concept, you'll see that it's still general on what we're asking everyone to agree on. But we wanted to get some perspective from you all on what kind of information and data should be submitted, and then what is on these acknowledgement and certificates. So here are some other topics to consider, and some of this has been talked about and has been raised by here today and previously. But conditions for a change in type of use or location of the groundwater use. So in other words, the type of change, conditions for a change in type of use could be, there could be some agricultural use that can convert maybe over to a municipal use. Or the location of the groundwater use. Maybe there's a farmer that wants to irrigate some land, you know, a mile away, and he's going to take some other land out of production, so he changes that location of use. Those conditions we've listed, no increase in water use, no increased impact to the aquifer, and a reduction in the amount of the certificated amount or the acknowledgement amount. In other words, do we make cuts to the aquifer as you make these transitions? So that's one topic to think about, to consider. And then another topic is what happens if the rural groundwater management area is rescinded. We've talked about a 20-year term potentially on these rural groundwater management areas. And what happens if the area becomes an AMA? Can these be used as evidence in the grandfathered right application process? So, yes, Sandy.
So, what we're seeking is certainty, and we want to know what we're going to be facing into the future, whatever the requirements are, we just want to know. These rural groundwater management areas, I don't see them necessarily going away in their entirety. That you should have something, a baseline, maybe that's where this concept of baseline comes in. Conservation at a minimum, metering and reporting so you continue to monitor the situation. But something has to remain to maintain water management, sound water management, whatever you want to call it. To me, that seems like that would be, I don't know, it just something's got to be left behind, rather than you just rescind it and everybody goes back to whatever. That's not certainty.
Okay, thank you. Any others? Sarah?
I'm wondering if hydrologically, it seems like the period for rescinding or sunsetting should be hydrologically based. And it seems like 3 years is very little. What does hydrology say?
No, I think we discussed 20 years.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I heard
Yeah,
3. Okay,
yeah,
great.
20, sorry. Yeah. Yes.
Just to echo Sandra's comment, Sandy. Especially if there's taxpayer investment in some of these conservation efforts, we wouldn't want to see an area be completely rescinded.
Okay. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is, I'm sorry, Chad.
Let me make one quick comment. So if my acknowledgement certificated right, whatever it is going to be reduced, if I change the use, that would discourage me from changing that use to a lower use crop.
Noted.
Could I ask about that?
Yes,
Even
Sarah.
if there was a much better market for your lower water use, wouldn't the profitability be pretty material in your crop choice? It would be a factor, but it would be a discouragement.
But you're still going to lose.
Yeah.
You're going to still get a reduction in.
If it's a use it or lose it, a forfeiture kind of situation, yeah.
And perhaps that's a condition that they can work through, that if there's a significant reduction in the overall amount of water, maybe there isn't, the cut to the aquifer is already there, right?
I'd have a question on that as well, if I could. What happens as has happened out in the Loop 303 if you have agricultural land and they sell it to industrial and it becomes a distribution center? Would that be another example?
And the change in the type of use is more of a transition between a type of use.
That helps.
Yeah.
That would be.
Yeah.
That would be good to clarify.
Versus a change in crop. Yeah.
Quick, just another question, Chad. One of the, when this came up in the LGSA discussions in the spring, what the rural group that put that together I thought was important to pair conservation program, incentives program with dedicated funding. And so having an opportunity like that where that transition could be paid for through a funding stream that would be enabled when the management plan is approved. I don't know if that would help, but to have the funding available, which is not the case in an AMA.
Thanks, Chris. Paul?
Thank you, Bruce. I'm just curious, could you give me a scenario where groundwater, whatever we're calling it, becomes an AMA? Why would that happen?
Transition from the rural groundwater management area to an AMA?
Right, I'm just curious what would trigger that?
So there are statutory criteria to create an AMA. This is Emily Petrick from ADWR. So there are statutory criteria to create an AMA. Those would remain in place regardless of whatever the criteria are to create this rural groundwater management area. So I don't think that it's anticipated in the framework right now that that criteria would change or would not still apply.
Yeah, this is Ben Kairos, also at ADWR. I would just add to if we're going to build into this that the rural groundwater management area can be rescinded, let's say it is rescinded and then an AMA is subsequently formed in the same basin, then these can still be useful items to document what you're, for applying for a GFR.
Ron?
I may be wrong, but I'm thinking that the boundary of an AMA is going to be typically a groundwater basin boundary, and at least the way we had seen this written up for the LGSAs, the boundaries of an LGSA, or whatever we want to call this tool, could be smaller than a basin. So in that case, I could see an AMA being formed and enveloping an LGSA.
From what I understand, I believe it was going to be the potentially in, we did talk about in Northeast Arizona where you have this huge groundwater basin. That's true, but I think in other areas of the state it would be the basin.
That's who I'm talking about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's see if we can come to some consensus. So we put together a high-level concept. Next slide, please. Oops. So I'll read through these, and hopefully we can come to agreement. There is a need to document current groundwater uses and users if a rural groundwater management area is established. It applies to all sectors and water use types served by non-exempt wells. There's a need for sufficient information to make acknowledgement determination, acknowledgement registry certificate. Subject to conservation or efficiency measures or other actions identified in the management plan needed to achieve the management area goal. Process to establish could be more streamlined than the AMA application process. And it provides flexibility for water users and the local economy while achieving the management area goal. Let you noodle on that for a second. Paul?
You pronounced could as should. I would suggest maybe we change could to should. Should be more streamlined, sorry.
This is the application process for...
Sharon, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Sharon McDowell. The application process for the quantification we're talking about, right?
For the creation of the actual certificate, registry, or acknowledgement.
For the acknowledgement. I mean, the acknowledgement is going to have a number with it, right? I realize the title is that, but yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So do we have general agreement on these high-level concepts? I see some thumbs up. Good. Good. Okay. Let's move on. Council duties. Required council duties. The council shall manifest its actions by motion, resolution, or other appropriate means. The council will make a complete record of its proceedings that are open to public review. The council will coordinate with ADWR in creating area goals and plan. They can request technical assistance from ADWR and recommend and send to the director the area goals and plan. We received committee comments on the required council duties. From Chris, the local council should have the ability through the management plan to either make requests to ADWR to act based on a set of predefined possible actions or make recommendations to relevant local jurisdictions. And duties should reflect balanced local choice with state oversight and technical and financial support. From Jamie and County Commissioner Langenfelter, council duties should be taken with full transparency. So I'll open it up to any comments. Sharon.
Yeah, Sharon McDowell. So I've had some questions about the staffing and support for the council. How does it do these things? And the way these words are up here, it seems very arm's length. You'll do all this stuff and then you'll give it to us and whatever. But when I've asked some people informally about this, it's been suggested that actually, and I think even in some of the written comments, I'm not sure, that ADWR staff would be supporting the councils. So I would appreciate some clarification of the thinking on that.
I think the next slide will talk a bit about that.
Okay,
and
thank
you'll
you.
Help
I'll
answer
wait.
some of those questions, hopefully. So from a high-level concept, see if we can agree to these two statements then based off of required council duties. Council must coordinate with DWR to draft and recommend area goals and plan that address the needs of the local basin. And ADWR issues final approval of the goals and portions of the plan to be implemented by ADWR, striking illegal or unconstitutional provisions and recommending against impractical provisions. We don't have it. Yeah. And I apologize, I don't have a slide for this. I can read through that again. The council must coordinate with DWR to draft and recommend area goals and a plan that address the needs of the local basin. And then DWR issues final approval of the goals and portions of the plan to be implemented by DWR, and then removing illegal and unconstitutional provisions and recommending against impractical provisions that could be in the plan. Can we agree to that? Okay, let's move on. Potential council duties. The council may gather additional information and data, commission or create reports, cooperate with federally recognized Indian tribes, cities, towns, counties, and other public or private agencies or organizations to engage in coordinated regional planning, establish a steering committee, advisory committee, or other structure to solicit and receive participation, comment, and advice from residents or other interested parties regarding the development and operation of the area plan. Seek and receive public and private monies to assist with its planning, management, and purpose. Negotiate, make, execute, acknowledge, and perform any contract, agreement, or obligation it deems advisable to achieving the goals. And committee comments that we see from Ron. Seek and receive public and private monies. This seems to leave a lot of room for interpretation. It should have no taxing authority, but it should be able to apply for grants and loans such as WIFA, including WIFA. From Chris, duties should reflect balanced local choice with state oversight and technical and financial support. And then from Chris, Jamie, and County Councilman Lingenfelter, the council should not have regulatory authorities. Authorities should ultimately remain with either local jurisdictions or with ADWR. And then from Janie and Council Commissioner Langenfelter, councils should have more substantial role than AMA GUACs. Councils should have interests of all residents and users, not just select few landowners. Yes, Sharon.
So, Bruce, you may recall, and I apologize that I didn't put this in again, I submitted a comment earlier on in one of the prior calls for homework that I didn't see how this council could enter into contracts. I didn't see what legal standing it would have to enter into a contract. I think that provision is problematic as I understand it.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon. Representative Travers.
Well, no, my question is to 1, 2, 3, the fourth bullet point down. Oh, sorry. The fourth point down to Supervisor Langenfelder's comment. A lot of the input, if we utilize whatever general plan municipalities have already constructed, in theory, you already have that public input, right? Because there's a period where people can comment and weigh in, and if you're using a portion of that general plan already as part of your goal, then and we're trying to streamline the process, this feels like you're kind of doing double duty over the same thing. I don't know, and I can't speak to Supervisor Langenfelder's intent, but is that not, that's how kind of I interpret it.
Any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, I was having a conversation. Can you repeat the question?
No, but the point I was saying is what, in reference to your comment and bullet point number 4, municipalities, when they're doing their general plan, already has public input and stakeholder input. So if we're trying to streamline the process, I'm assuming that in some of those goals and duties, you're already incorporating the feedback you've already received from your stakeholders and your citizens, residents, as part of the formation of your general plan going forward. Is that not correct?
I believe that's accurate. If you look at what's in statute now, I mean, first in 1973, then in 1998 with the Growing Smarter Act, then in 2000 with the Arizona, the Growing Smarter Plus, you should have all that information already, or a lot of it.
So are you thinking you should add in the general plan, following the general plan?
I think if you don't want to recreate a bunch of wheels.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'd also make a comment that do the GUAGs don't have term limits. I would say that there's probably or they do have term limits.
They do.
I would say it. Something I didn't see up on here is that the council members would have term limits.
Yeah. We haven't.
That'll be when we discuss the council membership, but right now we do have, I can't remember, either 5 or 10, but we can discuss that.
Yes, Ron.
So can the council hire somebody, or are they just going to depend on ADWR for support? And I agree with Sharon's comment about contracts. I would think they'd have to be a legal entity in order to enter into a contract with somebody, not just a club.
That was a question I had, was who's paying for what, and how's that, when it comes to
Isn't that gonna be
gathering
part-
additional information and data, first bullet?
That's a detail that we're going to have to work out, right? I think there was some recognition that there would be some money from the state potentially for these, I believe, early on. I don't know if that's still the case. Would that be a comment? Chris, any thoughts on how this would be funded? I think it was lottery funds, correct, from
Right.
the LGSA? Yeah.
Yeah, that was the funding mechanism defined in the bill, was excess lottery funds.
Right.
Right. And then I think, to Sharon's point, that make contracts, perhaps that's a duty that could move to DWR.
Yeah.
But I think the intention was to have the local council, at least in the original conception of the bill, as primarily a advisory body that made meaningful choices. But then when it came to implementation of any potential regulation, that would fall to the existing authorities. So primarily advisory body, but making meaningful choices.
Yes, Senator Kerr.
Thank you, Bruce. Just some general comments. As I've stated at the onset of our subcommittee, I'm generally opposed to these local councils made up without a vote of the people or elected. I think about even our local irrigation districts. Those members are elected. The NRCD members are elected. And when you think of the impact that these councils can have based on this framework, just for me, it's imperative that they are elected if there's going to be some kind of council. And just my concern again with that part, with the contracts, those actions, that authority, that's incredibly broad for an unelected council to have that kind of authority. And then I also wanted to note too, I don't see up here anything saying that the meetings are open to the public, and I think that's critical.
Okay.
This is Amelia Flores. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, I've been trying to unmute myself for the last half hour. But I wanted to ask a question on the third bullet, cooperate with federally recognized Indian tribes and the rest of the water users. How do you expect to engage these entities?
Yes.
I guess in many of these areas, when you establish one of these, I would think it would be in the best interest of a county or a city that's going to have to fund through taxpayer dollars or through applying for grants or some sort of other financing mechanisms to engage in these types of things.
Right.
It kind of goes to my point on the last item. Rather than giving this council the ability to do contracting and things like that, would not ADWR or a county or a city be able to do a contract or
Yes.
any of that stuff on their behalf? And really treating them more as a technical advisory committee. And then again, with respect, if it's an elective basis, I think we may not get the expertise that we need on these councils. If it just turns into a big election and popularity contest. So.
Thank you. Yes, Jay.
Thanks, Bruce. To Chairwoman Flores' point, I think given that there's sort of two levels of engagement, I agree with Supervisor Lingenfelter that the local council is going to have a clear incentive to cooperate with the shared resource that they have with a tribe that's within the groundwater boundaries. But I brought this up in I think a couple meetings ago, but It's also going to be important for ADWR that's going to take action to engage in sovereign-to-sovereign consultation before they do so. So I think it's both, it's in the best interest of the local users to make sure that there's communication in that, but there needs to be responsibility for DWR to engage formally as well.
Thank you. My next question is, the discussion earlier was on ADWR staff handling the certification and the process going through the staff in that department. So then does ADWR's duties then will have to reflect that in their, I guess their duties given by the governor, and also the chain of command, is that going to also reflect the duties under them to encompass the certification? Thank you.
This is Emily Petrick with ADWR. I think that for the certification, we're discussing an instance where this regulatory framework has already been established, and then DWR would be implementing it, including making decisions or determinations on the acknowledgements of groundwater use. So I just wanted to clarify that that would be ADWR's role at that point.
Chairwoman Flores, this is Tom. So we'll look at your question. We'll talk with our lawyers about what might need to be in the legislation, because we're talking about legislation here to create these new areas in terms of making it clear that DWR has the authority and the duty to analyze and create and assign these acknowledgements. So we'll look into that.
Thank you.
Sharon.
So I may have a question for Chris Kuzdas or you, Bruce and Tom. And I'm having some trouble understanding what the role of the council is. I know that's what we're talking about here, and I don't know that it's any less complicated than talking about the acknowledgement of the rights, which took us over an hour to discuss. But Chris, you've mentioned they're going to make meaningful decisions or inputs. So besides the fact that meaningful is in the eyes of the beholder, I have just a question of just what their authority is, and that may relate to the whole question of appointment. There are many, many bodies that have decision-making authority that are not elected. Typically elected groups are having something to do with taxing authority and stuff like that. And I served on the State Transportation Board. We approved the statewide plan, which involved hundreds of millions of dollars, and we were appointed. And so this whole question of what their authorities are, if I look at the GUACs, to me, they're clearly very limited in their scope. They have certain things that the department requests of them, expects of them, and clearly their input is advisory. When I think about this plan, this is just me speaking for myself, these plans for these groundwater management areas, I'm kind of thinking that the council would have a lot more to do with putting it together, but then ultimately it would be the department that would have to kind of sign off and review it and so forth. Maybe like, and forgive me for bringing in an AMA thing into this, but like the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District plan. The CAP board develops the plan and puts a lot into it, but then ADWR has to sign off on it. And I'm just having trouble just with these words, understanding just how much authority is being put in these groups. What is its relationship to the department and the department staff? And so, Chris, you worked on the LGSA legislation, and I know that's been the starting point, but we're changing. I think these are to me, very important questions of governance and responsibility, and they're just very unclear to me at this point.
I think that was a question for me, Sharon?
No. Go ahead, Chris.
All right, Bruce has called on me now. So Sharon, I think you kind of answered your own question. So the rural communities that put together the LGSA approach starting back last year, the idea of meaningful choice. Well, let me back up. So first of all, like Supervisor Lingenfelter said, the composition or the meaning of this of the local council is a technical advisory committee, right? Does not itself have any regulatory authority, and that's key to keep in mind. So when we say meaningful choice as a value that the rural communities want to see in this approach, it really comes to the management plan. And so in the LGSA framework, there's a set of pre-authorized tools that could be included in a management plan. And it's that interaction between the local council and DWR in crafting the plan where they can mix and match the tools. Because again, one of the principles in the approach was to create something that was adaptable and flexible to meet local needs, which vary in our rural basins. And so that was the concept behind the local council. And I think it is important to distinguish between this local council and a new political subdivision, which I think gets at, Senator Kerr's comments, where a vote of the people would be more indicative of creating a new political subdivision, which is not what we're doing here. That would be, or at least in the LGSA approach, like that would be growing government. And that's not what the rural communities wanted to do. And so that's why we don't think there's a need for a local vote, because the intention would be local advisory council that has expertise, but the actual regulatory authority rests with either the local jurisdictions that already exist, already have those authorities, or with DWR. Hopefully that answers the question, Sharon, but happy to talk more on the side on history of that idea if you'd like.
Thanks, Chris. Senator Kerr.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to Chris's comment on, having the consent of the governed is creating, bigger government. I think creating something like this with more bureaucracy and without the consent of the governed is, quite frankly, wrong and frightening in a lot of ways. We're dealing with property rights, water use, livelihoods, all of those things that are, would be subject to the what this council recommends to the director and would carry a lot of weight. And so I think it's, having the consent of the governed and having that kind of, that the people have a say, and I think is very, very important, and would not create, more government any more than, I mean, this would just create more bureaucracy and without a vote of the people. And so I disagree with Chris's comments on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Holland?
Yes.
If I may respond to that comment, that I would say that the voters or the citizens in an area would have representation in this process, because the voters elect their city councils and their town councils. They elect their county board of supervisors. They also, every 10 years, have to vote at a general election to adopt the general plan, which we were speaking about earlier. So there's a lot of public participation, basically saying, this is who we want to represent us on these things, water included, and this is what we want our region under the general plan to grow into in the next 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. Ron.
I just want to say, I don't think there's anything that prohibits an elected official from being appointed to or serving on the council. I know our boards with the associations that I work with are all elected officials. So
Thank you. So, yes, Chairman Miguel.
Again, I want to thank you for allowing us to be here. I just want to comment that we move forward to again work with tribes and the different entities and trying to find a way to cooperate as we move along. That not that we're trying to hinder the process. We want to work with the state, obviously. Tribes do as we move forward, and but there's 22 tribes in Arizona, as we know, and each has their own unique water settlement. So it's going to be a process overall, because I mean I know there's 3 tribal leaders on the council, which is myself, Governor Lewis, and Chairwoman Flores, but all 3 of us do not speak for the rest of the other tribes. So I just want the council to be cognizant at the fact that there is going to be other voices that are going to need to be heard. So again, but we do thank the council and the governor and the state for allowing us to be a part of it, because it's not going to really move forward the way we obviously want it to, or maybe the whole state, unless we're all involved. So 22 tribes, 22 voices, and us 3 do not speak for the others. So we really appreciate the fact that you guys are willing to work with all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. What our next future meeting, we will talk about membership of the council and how those members are selected. So just keep that in mind and be prepared for that discussion.
So before Bruce, we move on, I want to maybe say a couple of things. So we had a discussion about generally what the role of the council would be. It seems like we're gravitating towards the council as more of a technical advisor. I think that's what I heard across the board. So I guess in that vein, I'll ask folks and maybe my own lawyers, can a technical advisory group commission a report? Can it seek and receive public monies, blah, 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 in that bullet? Can it negotiate, make and execute contracts, et cetera? And I guess if we are going to make this purely a technical advisor, are those potential duties appropriate? And I'll throw that out. Anyone who would like to comment?
Mr. Allen, again, I would ask the question, would AWR, a county, a town, a city, a tribal council, would they not be able to do a contract or commission a study on this technical advisory commission's request?
I think that would obviously depend on the powers and duties granted to them in the legislation. So that's something we could evaluate and look at.
Chris.
Question, Director, and also maybe a question for Senator Kerr. If there were an opportunity to go through these duties and get at some of the questions that the director was raising and refine the duties, could that potentially allow an opportunity to revisit the need for an election of the local council?
My initial response is no. I mean, it would, I just don't, I cannot fathom having a council unelected, unaccountable to the governed, be able to make these types of decisions that, clearly want to contemplate, reduce in a water acknowledgement, prohibit economic activity and those types of things. I think it's just paramount that they be elected.
Thank you. Chad.
I'm going to jump in here because I echo Senator Kerr's comments. And we put it, I'm not going to belabor it because we put it in our comments, but I think anytime you allow the locals to have a voice in it, it makes for a much smoother process. And I think we can't deny from those locals having a voice. in an election process. And I get your comments as far as they're elected, totally understand that, but I still think the users having a voice at the polls and being able to vote for it is key.
Mr. Holland, I'd have one
Yes,
counterpoint to
County
that.
Commissioner.
I sure wish that at the county level, the citizens had an opportunity to talk about corporate agriculture moving into Mojave County 10 years ago, because we probably wouldn't be at this table today. Mojave County didn't get a voice. We didn't get any sort of their elected officials didn't get any sort of a regulatory approval process, because if you own 5 or more acres, and in our area they own tens of thousands, they just moved in and they could just farm it. And then combined with no groundwater rules at all, in our area it's just a recipe for disaster. So I agree that citizens should be represented in every aspect.
Yes, Sharon.
Just a little technicality here. I've been an elected official, CAP board. Somebody has to pay for the election when there's elections. Just somewhere there has to be money for that coming from somewhere.
Thank you. Chris?
I'm certainly in favor of the concept of an election. I just would, I guess, I'm looking at what happened in Washington recently, and I just wouldn't want it to be politicized. Hopefully it could be, that could be avoided in any kind of election that took place.
Representative Travers.
I just want to point out, and yet here we are. We have several elected officials, and yet nobody elected us to be on this council. We are speaking on behalf of a lot of people throughout the state, and if there was a lot of pushback on it, then we would have sort of said, I'm not going to be on this council until I know that I'm going to be elected on it by the will of the people to represent, because we're making some pretty big decisions here for people in the rest of the state. But some of us have been elected to do that on their behalf already. And so otherwise, we would just be at the legislature, and every time we wanted to do a law, we would go ahead and put it up to a vote to the people of Arizona. But we don't. We get elected, or we get appointed in some states, you know, some stages or whatever.
Okay.
That's just my point.
Without those 3 bullets. Okay. Just do that. Okay. Okay.
Mr. Holland, if I could just echo on
Yes.
Representative Travers. The technical advisory, non-elected, these councils really need to in order to add value, the members need to be selected based upon their technical competence and not elected based upon their ideology. Because if you have a bunch of people that are elected on ideology, you're probably not going to get a lot done.
Thank you. Yes, Chad.
One last comment, because I think we're getting ready to adjourn, but I just wanted to clarify. So the certification discussion basically mirrored an IGFR. We support a certified right, which rewards conservation. And so what was presented here today was pretty much a IGFR version 2.0.
And my staff reminded me when I asked that the water duties for the IGFRs originally were done on the 5-year average of the crops grown and the water use, and maybe a concept, whatever we decide in terms of that time period, so that we're not doing what Paul suggested and sticking them with a year in which they might have used a low water use crop. So we can get back to that when we talk more about the acknowledgements.
If I could, what I'd like to do is, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to belabor things, but I was just looking on bullet number 4, where it talks about halfway through advice from residents and other interested parties, ... Can that just say groundwater users? Is that being too singling out, or just not broad enough, or? Bullet four, mid-sentence.
And advice from groundwater users.
I just ask, so for instance, if you get your water from the city of Kingman, do you qualify as a groundwater user? And shouldn't that resident have some ability to participate in kind of this transparent discussion? And I think that's part of the reason we have the residents in there.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
No, not correction. Yes.
No, thanks for bringing that up, because I was looking at it from my vantage point. so
Understand.
Thank you.
If I could, since we're close to 3 o'clock, and Tom had suggested that this is more of a technical council. And I believe you've all agreed to that to a majority agreement. What I'd like to make is a high-level concept, but remove bullet 2, second bullet, for now, and the 5th and 6th bullet for now, since there seems to be some consternation about those bullets, and make a motion for a high-level concept that the council will have these duties and may have other duties, responsibilities, and capabilities to be finalized in legislation. Yes, Sharon.
Yeah, just one thing about bullet 4. If this thing is truly going to be technical, just assuming that it has to create another structure as opposed to do the act of getting the input seems like maybe that's a bit much. I think the important point is having the transparent and inclusive process. That's a responsibility. And I just think some of that it's fine, but I don't think it should be required that they establish other structures to do some of those things.
And it's May, so I don't believe it is
okay,
required.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not reading fast enough today, sorry.
So I guess I would ask for responses back to the high-level concept. At this point, not including bullet item, the second bullet item, and then the last 2 bullet items. That the council will have these duties and may have other duties, responsibilities, and capabilities to be finalized in legislation. Yes, Senator Kerr.
I just wanted to note my objection.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Yeah, maybe we can show the previous slide. We'll focus on this at the next meeting, the groundwater management goals. So have a chance to take a look at this since we are at close to 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to bring that up. Next slide. Upcoming meetings and next steps. So we'll talk about the next rural groundwater committee meetings on the 19th. So we've got a couple of weeks. There's some homework for you all. And then the next water policy council meeting is October 27th, at least tentatively scheduled for the 27th. So what are next steps? Committee members to review and discuss the framework with their constituents and colleagues to provide feedback at the next meeting on area plan, and we'll provide you information on that, and council membership and groundwater goals. Today, we'll review the input from today's meeting and continue to update the framework. And we are preparing a measuring and reporting proposal that we should have available for you all to review before the meeting on the 19th. So we'll want to discuss that on the 19th also. Next. So with that, if there are any concluding remarks from the director or any final comments?
No, thanks for the good discussion. Lots of good ideas. I think if they helped us tweak some of the concepts as we drawn them out before the meeting. And again, thanks to everyone for your participation, and thanks for the continued progress towards our ultimate goal, again, of getting recommendations to the governor in December.
If there are no other comments, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you all. Thank you very much. And thanks for those online listening in. Thank you.